In this lecture, I'll be taking you through the actual factors that make up for a good story. So to remind you, in the earlier lecture, I took you through the main frames of what a movie goes through. And just to help you put this into context, I'll be using the example of Lion King as a way of entrenching the principles that you will learn in this lecture. So as a reminder, a good movie has 4 frames. 1 is the context, 2 is the problem that needs to be solved for, 3 is the resolution, and 4 is the overall moral or lesson learned from that movie. Now, in terms of the structure, which is also included in the resource section of this course, I'm going to be calling the context, which is your premise. That means how the story is starting. And under premise is a few factors that you need to think about when you're putting your story together. The problem and the resolution of your story, I'll be calling the plot. And again, when you're putting your story together, there's a few factors to consider in this section. And finally, the last section, which is the conclusion or moral or lesson learned, I'll be calling the profound point. And this is the main part of your story. And if you get this right, your audience really connects with you. So let's put this together. And again, I'll be using the analogy of Lion King as an example to entrench the principles. So under premise, this is the context setting of your story. I want you to think about the people that are involved in your story. So in Lion King, as an example, you have Mufasa, which is the head of the Pride Land. And he's now got a son that he was wanting to take over that Pride Land. So basically you're introducing all these key characters. You have Scar, who wants to take over the Pride Land, but now he'll never be king. And so by introducing these characters into your story, it's setting the context of what is to come. To help you set the scene even further, the second factor to consider under context setting is the place. So where is your story taking place? And in Lion King, it's taking place somewhere in Africa that's called the Pride Land. And again, in your story, you need to set the context as to where your story is taking place. The more detail you add into it, the more your audience can understand the context in which your problem is about to exist. The third is panorama. And in here you need to describe the scene. What was happening at the time of your story? What were the smells? What were the sights? What were you hearing? How did you feel? The more you describe this, the more your audience can connect with it. And again, if you look at the Lion King, the context is very nicely set, where this celebration mode happens in the first context of the movie, and everyone is so happy that a new baby has been brought into this Pride Land. And if you remember the first part of Lion King, it's all excitement and happiness about teaching an upcoming prince to be a future king. And so by implementing the first 3 factors of people, place, panorama, your story has now got the factors to set the context for what is to come. And the next stage is the plot. So your first section under this phase is to describe the pain. What was the pain that your characters are going through? In Lion King, the pain is brought in a few aspects. There's Scar, who wants to be king but can never be king. And so he comes up with a plot to remove the existing heirs to the throne, which in this case is Simba, and the existing king, which is Mufasa. The pain also comes a bit later on in the form of Simba, who believes that he killed his father. And so he's banished from the Pride Land and he'll never be king. And so that's where the problem starts existing. The second factor is what was done to pacify this pain. And what I mean by that is what was done to try to resolve it. In Lion King, to pacify this, Simba removes himself from the Pride Land. And so he tries to exist in his own life outside of that and to live a life of Hakuna Matata, where there is no worry in the world. The third aspect in the plot to get right is personalize. So somewhere in your story, you need to bring in some humor, bring in some fun, make the mood a little bit more lighter. It's called self-deprecating humor. And in here you add some fun and play into your story. In Lion King, the humor came in the form of Timon and Pumbaa, who provided some comic relief and added some fun into Simba's life. The last aspect to get right under plot is what is known as a patriarch. A patriarch is someone in your story that offered you guru advice. It's that words of wisdom that got you to start thinking differently about your situation and got you to change your existing circumstances. In The Lion King, the patriarch came in the form of a few. There was Nyala, who came and found Simba and said, "You must come back and fight for your pride land." It came in the form of Mufasa in the dream, coming from the cloud and saying, "You are my son, come back." And so he comes back. And was also in the form of Rafiki, the monkey, who hits him on the head and says, "Go back and fight for your kingdom." So these are the patriarch figures that provides this advice, the wisdom. And so in your story too, you have to look back on your challenge at the time. Someone offered you that wisdom, that wise words that allowed you to think differently about your situation. And because of that, you acted differently, you felt differently, and you made the change in your life. The final stage of your story is moving into resolution and conclusion. And so the first element in here, the first factor, is what is known as a paradigm shift. A paradigm shift is where the character in your story, which is yourself, starts thinking differently about themselves and they act differently. So it could have been a phrase, a quote, some sort of advice that caused them to act differently, and you want to be able to describe that. The second is a phrase that puts your story together. In The Lion King, the words are the circle of life. The movie starts off with a cub being born and it ends off with a cub being born. And the phrase of the circle of life just encompasses that story. So likewise, when you're putting your story together, think of a phrase that summarizes your story in a nice, catchy way that your audience can relate to. And finally, the last factor to summarize your story is what is known as pensive. Pensive means to think about, to ponder over. By the time you end your story, your audience should be thinking differently about you, your background, and more importantly, they should be on your side. You must be able to get to a point where they can trust you, and your story connects you directly to your audience. And when you share your story with your audience, then they are able to listen to the rest of your content, of whatever it is that you have to share. Now at this point, people often ask me, how long should a story be? And I say it depends. So say you are delivering a speech for about 10 minutes, from beginning to the end. Just take about maybe a minute and a half perhaps, just to give a brief background about yourself, covering these factors that make up for a good story. If you have the luxury of a longer time frame, say a 45-minute talk, a 30-minute talk, maybe an hour talk, then you can spend a little bit more time on your background, maybe around 2 to 3 minutes. However long it takes that your audience understands you, understands your background, and they can trust that you are credible to speak on that topic. This concludes this lecture, and I hope by now you have got the framework of what it takes to put a good story together. As an additional resource to this lecture, I've included a bit of a checklist that includes all of these factors that make for a good story. I've also included links to online videos that you can click with the resource link. And what I'd like you to do is to review those videos. They're very funny, engaging videos. I've given you 3 options on the videos. And I'd like you to use the checklist and listen to these stories and see where the speakers have brought in the factors of what makes for a good story. And also, when you watch the video, I want you to be judgmental. Before the person speaks, I want you to even think, what is it that you believe about this person just based on how they look, on how they dress, and just their overall appearance? And by the time you get to the end of the video, I want you to assess how you now think about them at the end of that video. And I will guarantee you that because you've now heard their story and their background, your initial perception about them has completely changed by the time you heard their background and their story. And that's the heart and the power of a good story. It can completely change your audience perception about you and your credibility. Go ahead now and watch those videos, and I'll see you on the next lecture.